I honestly think it's a shame that this plane is largely remembered as being the second most successful transport plane of World War II, because it turned into one of the most gangster cargo planes real quick. Today we're going to lift the veil on the second of America's big World War II cargo planes and the younger brother of Douglas Aircraft's C-47, the C-54 Skymaster. And while this aircraft may have been born into its brother's shadow in the Second World War, after the war it would distinguish itself in ways its brother never could. And to tell the story of the C-54, we gotta start with the story of its smaller, older brother, that being the Douglas Aircraft Company's DC-3. The DC-3 had taken the commercial airliner world by storm, and Douglas was already hard at work on one-upping it, especially with the recently introduced Boeing Stratoliner starting to turn some heads. And since nobody gives up on the crown without a fight, Douglas would start fighting back against the pull of Boeing by designing the DC-4E, E meaning experimental. The first rendition of the DC-4 would come with a triple tail to lower overall height and thus the size of required maintenance facilities, 4 engines, and a pressurized cabin when it entered mass production. In the passenger bay, the DC-4E would carry 42 passengers by day or 30 by night, and the reason there was fewer at night was because they actually had room for people to sleep on board, because this was still back in the day when flight was mostly done by wealthier individuals, so they would actually give you a bed to sleep in instead of a dark freezing cabin to turn you into a seatsicle.
It's cold in here!
But if you thought sleeping accommodations were the weirdest part of this plane, think again, because this plane was the late 1930s equivalent of an influencer. It was designed to hop on a trend. See, because of how new commercial aviation was at the time, a lot of those rich folks who could afford to fly also thought it would be a great idea to get married on an airplane and scoop up those 1930s brownie points so they could go home after their honeymoon and rub it in everyone else's face. And because of this, the DC-4E was designed to have a private bridal room in the back where the bride and bridesmaids could prepare themselves for the wedding. Stop. Douglas Aircraft made a commercial airliner that was built from the ground up to be so rich that people could get married on a plane in the middle of the Great Depression. This is so capitalist it makes the capitalists ask questions. And because it was so high-end in the middle of the Great Depression, it was shut down in the prototype phase after its first flight on June 7, 1938 because it was too large and complex for it to be maintained cheaply.
I am completely broke!
So in 1939, the American, Eastern, and United Airlines companies presented Douglas Aircraft with a list of requirements they would need from a new airliner, and began coordinating to create a long-range aircraft capable of crossing oceans. Translation: Douglas took the DC-4E and dumbed it down into the DC-4. This new airplane would keep the 4-engine design, initially sporting 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000 radial engines worth 1,350 horsepower apiece. It would also keep its nose-wheel steering and even got an autopilot, while still being able to carry 40 people during the day and 28 at night. However, those cost reductions would simplify the DC-4 down to having a single tail and an unpressurized cabin. This rendition was a much desired improvement, and there was a lot of interest from civilian airlines. And when you get a lot of civilian attention with a vehicle of some kind, guess whose attention you also get? The U.S. military.
Hello there.
See, by 1940, the War Department was starting to want 4-engined and long-range transports for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost of those being that World War II had already started and America knew it was only a matter of time before the war came to them. A long-range transport could bring delegations to and from faraway nations in less time, helping to speed up the diplomatic process and better prepare America and its allies for the upcoming need to coordinate. It was also faster than moving people by boat, so having a plane that could bring pilots ferrying Lend-Lease supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific to the United Kingdom and Soviet Union back to the United States in less time meant that the US could turn them around faster with more Lend-Lease supplies and deliver more stuff in less time as well. And if, by chance, said transport could also carry supplies, then you really hit the efficiency goldmine by bringing supplies one way and people back the other, which is the logistics formula that has been used by the US military's medical system for decades now. The US Army Air Force initially used converted B-24 Liberators for this, called the C-87s, but when the safety of those planes was called into question, they began eyeing the C-54 for the role, along with the C-46 just in case it failed. And then everything changed when the Imperial Japanese attacked. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, the sleeping giant is awoken, and America enters the chat. It is now game on. And since America doesn't know what it's going to take to win this war, they send everything forward on the throttle and commandeer every single civilian aircraft production line they can get their hands on to make planes for the war effort. But that doesn't mean they didn't have their priorities. In the case of Douglas Aircraft, they already had established an operational manufacturing infrastructure for the C-47 Skytrain and C-53 Skytrooper transports, along with the A-20 Havoc attack bomber, all of which the US Army Air Force had already ordered and was now going to need large numbers of. And 9 times out of 10, a new production line is going to require resources that are going to slow down the production of other planes. So the War Department basically came down to Douglas and told them that if there was any possibility of the C-54 interfering with the production of the other planes they already wanted, the game was over.
And all bets are off.
Donald Douglas, not that guy, this one, the owner of the Douglas Aircraft Company, had to personally reassure the War Department that there wouldn't be any issues before they were permitted to continue the DC-4's production, with all completed aircraft overriding their civilian orders and being transferred to the US Army Air Force as the C-54 Skymaster, or eventually to the Navy,
Not the Navy!
as the essentially identical R-5D. The first C-54 rolled off the production line in February of 1942, first flew on the 26th of March, and entered service with the Army Air Force in June. But the Navy wouldn't get their R-5Ds until next year, after their first flight on the 22nd of February, and eventually picking up 205, mostly as hand-me-downs from Army procurement. And the Army's first 24 C-54s weren't exactly mission-ready either. They came off the production line as is, without heavy lift modifications, and as a result did not have the reinforced floor they needed to carry the tons of cargo it could be capable of. These early versions were mostly relegated to high-profile transportation before the production lines were reworked to build the cargo-capable C-54As. But after they entered service in February the following year, from that model onwards, all C-54s would be built with fold-away seats, reinforced floors, cargo doors, and a lift, followed by more fuel and better engines as the variants progressed. These cargo-capable C-54s could carry 10 short tons of cargo, 20,000 pounds, almost 3 times as much as the C-47's 3.5 short tons. And by the end of the war, their engines had been clocked up from 1,350 horsepower to 1,450. The cost per plane had also decreased over the war due to manufacturing scale, but even though the DC-4 had been made simpler than the DC-4E, the C-54's unit cost was still staggering. The aircraft was originally $500,000 a pop in 1940, and while that had dropped by half to $250,000 by 1945, that still made it the third most expensive aircraft of World War II, only behind the atomic bomb-carrying Boeing B-29 Superfortress and its soon-canceled rival, the consolidated B-32 Dominator.
Too rich for my blood.
And on the surface, that cost seems all the more like a waste of money due to its lack of fame, because the C-54 wouldn't fly nearly as many noteworthy missions as its older brother. The Skymaster was primarily assigned to just do its job under the newly formed Air Transport Command, whose only responsibilities were moving the government stuff from Theater A to Theater B. They also wouldn't go to forward airfields very often because the wheels were so heavily loaded they would punch through the perforated steel planking used to build forward airstrips and just tear up the entire thing like a cratering bomb whenever it landed.
I'm on it!
This problem in particular would even get in the way during its later service in the Korean War, causing them to initially suspend operations during the first few weeks. However, there was one capability that the C-54 had in spades over the C-47. Its range. The C-47 was too short-legged to handle literally crossing half the planet with tons of stuff on board, and so the C-54 would do it instead and effectively become the primary precursor to America's strategic heavy lift capabilities. And Skymaster pilots felt like Skymasters because the C-54 did not play around in the pilot comfort department. While the Skymaster had an autopilot, pilots actually preferred controlling it manually because the inputs were light and easy to handle, unlike planes like the B-24 and C-47 where you were basically trying to put a bear in a headlock the entire time you were airborne. Apparently, there was also a running story that the pilots believed it was better at handling ice than the B-17 or B-24, and I'm not sure they meant ice cream. In-flight icing is a problem where ice builds up due to moisture in the air, condensing on the airframe, and then freezing due to the air temperature. This reduces range and efficiency in the best of cases, and causes planes to crash in the worst of them. And I'm guessing that the old pilot's tale meant that it could resist more in-flight icing than its peers, which you could argue is backed up by its safety record. The C-54 and its variants made 79,642 transoceanic flights during its World War II career, with only 2 or 3 flights where the pilots had to ditch the aircraft, and one of those was intentional. On top of that, out of the over 1,160 C-54s picked up by the US military between 1942 and 1945, only 29 of them crashed. It was nearly perfectly consistent and incredibly safe, at least during the war, to the point where the only theater it didn't have an immediate impact on the war's success was probably the China-Burma-India or CBI theater. US operations in China against the Japanese relied on US supply drops as much as the next theater over, but there was a problem. Due to the threat of Japanese fighters turning cargo planes into MIA statistics, the only safe route American supplies could take was the hump, a flight path that took aircraft over the Himalayan mountains and to altitudes that the unpressurized C-54's pilots couldn't survive.
I can't breathe.
We're too high up. You're running out of air.
That makes sense.
This route had to be run by other cargo planes until Brigadier General Frank Merrill took over the Japanese-held airfield at Myitkyina. This boat deprived the Japanese of a forward operating base and gave the US a forward position to allow their aircraft to fly at lower altitudes safely. C-54s would still have some trouble in that region because the maintenance wasn't as available as it typically needed, but even with that issue persisting, the Skymaster would continue to be a major component of the American logistical flex that was its ability to put boot-to-rear technology on any ground anywhere in the world. It developed enough of a reputation during the war that it started to see more unique use, with the British flying 23 Skymasters on loan and others becoming personal transports for officers, like General Douglas MacArthur. In what I can only call the most infuriating bout of irony, MacArthur renamed his Skymaster Bataan, in honor of the soldiers that he left behind in the Philippines to deal with the Bataan Death March. But it's fine, because the Skymaster wasn't just fitted for carrying glory-hogging MacArthur. One was even custom-made to carry the people who were bigger than him. In early 1945, the US completed the construction of a custom-made C-54 codenamed Sacred Cow. This was a purpose-built Skymaster transport with a battery-powered elevator, a large conference room with a rectangular bulletproof window, private sleeping quarters with a hidden fold-down bed, a major office with a private bathroom next to the desk, and even an electric refrigerator, which by itself makes it one of the most advanced planes of its time. Now that's really cool, but it also raises a really important question. Why did the US Army Air Force need a plane with so much custom tech and high-level space on board? Because this plane was officially designated the VC-54C, and it was made for the sole purpose of carrying then-President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is the first Air Force One, and they named it after a farm animal.
Moo, moo, moo.
Regardless of its naming convention, though, the Sacred Cow was the plane that flew FDR to the Yalta Conference. This flight was so high security that they changed the tail number before the flight and then flew into Yalta with a formation of 33 other quad-engine transports, literally using the philosophy of, they can't catch all of us with cargo planes. But while FDR was the person the plane was made for, he only got to use it once and died shortly afterwards. But after his successor, President Harry Truman, entered office, the VC-54C would then be used extensively for the next 27 months until it was replaced by a presidential edition DC-6, which is still technically a DC-4, but I digress. However, one very noteworthy feat would happen before the Sacred Cow was replaced. Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 during one of his flights, which created the Air Force. Yeah, you thought that picture was taken in a building, didn't you? So did I. Nope, that picture was taken on a freaking cargo plane. The Marines were born in a bar, the Army was born in Congress to punch the British Army in the face, the Navy was born in Congress to tell Jack Sparrow to pound salt water, and the Air Force were born on the OG Air Force One. Let no one say that the military can't be poetic.
Captain Jack Sparrow, if you please, sir.
And the Sacred Cow wasn't the only C-54 to start getting even more gangster, because this thing would start racking up the achievements literally the minute after World War II ended. Right after the Japanese surrendered, a C-54 would set a Tokyo to Washington flight record of 31 hours and 25 minutes. Why did it set that record? Oh, you know, just to bring the film of the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri back to the United States. A cargo plane literally set a speed record for flying halfway across the planet set solely because
Pixar didn't happen.
C-54s would begin carrying U.S. occupation forces to Japan on August 28, 1945, and over the following months, many of the C-54s would be released from military service back to the civilian airliner companies that had contracted them in the first place. Canadair would also pick up a manufacturing license in these post-war years to make the C-54 GM, which was similar to the base C-54 except that it used the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines from the P-51 Mustang, which pumped out 1,725 horses each. Talk about going places. Civilian airliners would get a pressurized cabin while Royal Canadian Air Force models would get the nickname North Star. But meanwhile, those C-54s still in U.S. Air Force service would start playing around with roles other than cargo planes. For starters, there were the JC-54s, which were made to recover the nose cones from missile launches, TC-54 trainers, VC-54D VIP transports, and SC-54s for search and rescue, which lived past 1962 and were subsequently renamed the HC-54s. Then there were the MC-54M flying hospitals with onboard litters, which evacuated 851 American civilians and medevaced 6,600 U.S. soldiers back stateside both before and after the Korean War started. But one of the first C-54 variants was definitely the AC-54Ds, which, contrary to the name, were not gunships. The AC-54s were electronic intelligence and reconnaissance planes, which were later renamed the EC-54s and upgraded to the EC-54U standard before their use in Vietnam looking for North Vietnamese radio transmitters. Some of these variants would live on for years past the rest of their brethren, the majority of which, including the Sacred Cow, were eventually retired by October of 1961, which, as you might have guessed, means that the World War II transport lived to see the F-4 Phantom and many other Vietnam-era jet fighters. I'm gonna say that again but slower. This was a piston-engined prop plane made for rich people in the Great Depression, and it lived long enough to see us go from basic piston-driven fighters to doubling the sound barrier.
Impressive. Very nice.
But for all its feats and milestones, the C-54's real place of honor wouldn't come from Vietnam, or Korea, or even during World War II. The C-54 made its mark in history right at the start of the Cold War, where it would earn the nickname the Workhorse of the Berlin Airlift. Most of the story of how this happened has been covered by creators like The Fat Electrician, so we'll keep the how and when short and sweet. Basically, right after World War II ended, Germany was split up into East and West, with East Germany owned by the Soviet Union and West Germany split into three parts owned by the US, the UK, and France. Berlin, the capital city, was split up the same way, but it was located entirely within the eastern half and thus surrounded by the Soviet Union. And when the Soviets tried to take over all of Germany by tanking the value of the primary currency, the West stepped in to print a new currency and try to restore the German economy so people wouldn't starve to death. In turn, the Soviets would lose all of their chill and lock down the roads that would allow the West to supply Berlin, leading President Truman to make the call not to leave and the US to begin Operation Vittles along with the UK, officially known by history as the Berlin Airlift. Starting on the 26th of June 1948, American and British cargo planes would carry in as many supplies as they could: food, water, coal, medical supplies, and more, all to try and supply the West German citizens with a living they wouldn't die from.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Every single C-54 the US had left was pressed into service to help out with this monumental task. The US side of the US-UK task force started with only 54 C-4s and 107 C-47s. But by September of 1948, the Air Force made the decision to pull the C-47s out of the operation due to the smaller cargo load, and rely almost exclusively on the C-54s for the airlift from then on. Truth be told, the task force in charge only had 255 active C-54s at its peak, with more in reserve to be rotated in during the rapidly acquired maintenance intervals and many others flying supplies directly from the US to continental Europe to maintain the airlift. The C-54s would adapt really well to this mission set. In fact, 38 C-54Es were modified into C-54Ms just for this operation, having their interiors stripped down so they could carry another 2,500 pounds of coal into Berlin with each flight. Even some of those non-cargo versions would get in on the action, because in the midst of the soon-to-be carefully coordinated magic of the airlift, at least one of the Eland AC-54Ds would be snuck in amongst the highways of planes. This thing didn't deliver cargo, but was instead used to monitor Soviet communications and radars across the corridor while the operation was active. Because that's the difference between capitalism and communism. Even when we're literally moving heaven and earth to save people, we can still find time to keep an eye on the enemy.
Both.
Both is good.
But during the airlift, the US would see a main character show up by the name of Lieutenant Gale S. Halverson. Halverson was one of the pilots participating in the Berlin airlift, but he was also an airplane photographer, and between missions, he was out by the chain link fence around the runways filming the aircraft coming in for landings with a personal movie camera. One day while he was doing this, he ran into a bunch of kids hanging out on the other side of the fence, about 30 of them between the ages of 8 and 14. He only knew enough German to say hello, but one of those kids spoke English and began acting as a translator, and the next thing he knows, Halverson is telling the kids all about the stuff coming in on the next few planes. This conversation lasts about an hour, and then he gets up to leave, takes 5 steps, and then it hits him. None of the kids had asked him for anything.
None of you?
And that might sound like them just being polite, but here's the thing. Every time an American soldier rolled into a foreign city in World War II after things settled down, the kids would always be chasing them around and asking them for candy and gum. And these kids here in Berlin were literally in the middle of a food blockade. If anything, they should have badgered him for it the minute he said hello. They probably would have been perfectly justified in doing so. So he turns around, and I'm guessing that he probably asked something along the lines of if they were hungry or if they wanted some candy, and these kids give him the most eye-opening response he's ever heard, because they tell him, quote, "When the weather gets so bad that you can't land, don't worry about us. We can get by on little food, but if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back. Just don't give up on us."
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
These German kids knew that the lives that had been given to them by their dictator in World War II and the lives offered by the Soviets under Stalin were effectively one and the same. They were finally free from a system that only cared about destroying things, that only cared about destroying their enemies and using fear to prevent the creation of more. And life under a system like that is a prison and nothing else. Anyone who trades freedom for security rarely gets either. So Halverson turns around and pulls out 2 sticks of chewing gum. It's all he has. It's nowhere near for all 30 kids, and even if he breaks it up into pieces for them, which he does, they still might try and fight over it. But they don't. The kids who didn't get either of the 4 pieces only asked to pass the wrapper around so they can get a smell of the gum. The first response that Halverson has is just sheer shock at the humility of the kids. And the second thought is the knowledge that he has to do more. So he promises the kids that he will be back tomorrow with enough gum for all of them. And when one of the kids asked how they would know which plane was his, he told them that he'd wiggle his wings as he came in, something that the last time he'd done was for his mother when he passed his pilot's exam in 1941. And sure enough, when he finally came back in 100 feet off the ground, right before the barbed wire fence in front of the runway, Halverson and his crew made their first candy drop from their C-54 Skymaster on July 18, 1948, earning him a nickname from the kids, Onkel Wackelflügel, which in English translates roughly to Uncle Wiggly Wings. He would do this every day with the gradual and increasing assistance of his squad, and increase the amount of candy on each drop. And 3 weeks later, a newspaper was published with a picture of his aircraft and the small cloth parachutes they tied the candy to coming out of it, giving him a new nickname: the Candy Bomber. With a newspaper running the story, it wouldn't take long for the chain of command and the officer in charge, Lieutenant General William Tunner, to hear about this. And soon, Halverson found himself in the office of his squadron commander, Colonel James R. Hahn, who wanted to know what he was doing and why. Halverson was actually being considered for a court-martial until Tunner's response got back down to Hahn, pardoning Halverson's actions and telling him something along the lines of, "Keep it up, but keep me informed."
Well done.
The candy bombings would spread to even more pilots, and then the candy companies back home would start donating to the effort, with American school kids even helping out and tying parachutes to the candy for the drops. The Soviet blockade would finally come to an end on the 5th of May, 1949, but to make sure the Germans had a stockpile of supplies in the event that the Soviets tried this trick again, they would continue the airlift until the end of September that year. 2.3 million tons of cargo had been moved by airplane only into Berlin. 75% of this was done by American planes, primarily the C-54 Skymasters. U.S. aircraft as a whole accumulated over 189,000 flights, almost 600,000 flight hours, well over 92 million miles flown, and 250,000 parachutes carrying 23 tons of candy. And that is at least most of the story of the C-54 and the madmen who flew them. And while I will never be one of them, I would like to take a page out of the Skymaster and Halverson's Candy Bomber book and help out some kids. Because for this week, I am partnering with Gamers Outreach for their 2025 VTuber Summer Slam. Gamers Outreach is a charity that helps out kids in hospitals by getting them gaming equipment. because kids, who are still learning the world around them, don't fully understand why staying in the hospital can be so isolating and overwhelming. Giving them something fun and entertaining to play with during their stay helps them relax and make memories while they feel more comfortable with getting better. Those games can even be used to directly aid with recovery or for education to help kids learn new things as they recover. And this year, I want to blow away the goal harder than Grandpa Buff's bombing runs. We've already sent our first goal into the stratosphere harder than that one manhole cover in the 50s. But why stop at giving physics a reason to doubt itself when we can give quantum physics the same treatment? So here's the call to arms. Go ahead and hit that link on screen or in the description below sometime before this Sunday, June 29th, and donate to Gamers Outreach and the 2025 VTuber Summer Slam. It'd mean a good bit to me, but it would matter way more to those kids if we could turn this video into something more than a story. So let's send the old Hail Mary. And thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.